افغانستان یا خارج تانستن بیان بیرون اونا رو بتونیم کمک بکنیم. So I will go back now into English, and I will be covering mainly the current measures that were introduced to help with the crisis in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation. And if I sound disorganized a little bit, or I don't have all of the information, please forgive me. It has been a very busy couple of weeks for us with a lot of inquiries and a lot of updates every day. So currently, the current programs that are available are listed on the Canada.ca website. If you go on the Canada.ca website, from there you select CIC, and then you can select the Canada's response to the situation in Afghanistan button. Under that, you will see all the programs that are currently available to assist Afghans and Afghan Canadian or Afghans who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents, and those who are applying for temporary residence. So I'll go basically in the same way that it is introduced on the Canada.ca website, the Immigration Citizenship website. The first measure or program that has been introduced is for applications that are being submitted by Afghans who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And under that, the government is offering to prioritize the processing of certain types of applications, to waive certain fees for the processing of certain types of applications, and finally, the requirement to have a valid passport or travel document. The first priority is under family reunification, and that's basically sponsorships of eligible family members. Eligible family members are spouses or dependent children. For some, they also allow orphan relatives under the age of 18 if they meet certain requirements. So under the family reunification, basically you would be sponsoring your spouse who is in Afghanistan or outside of Afghanistan, and the special measure that has been introduced to assist those applicants is a priority for processing of their applications. For permanent residents, applicants who are in Canada as protected persons, these are all related to Afghan nationals who have now become a permanent protected person in Canada. Protected person is someone who applied for refugee protection and was able to receive that protection in Canada. And then they submit an application for permanent residence in which they can include certain family members. Those family members are dependent family members, again, spouses and dependent children who are 21 or under the age of 21. And if they're over the age of 22, they have to show the child is over the age of 22. They have to show that they have been relying on emotional and financial support of their parents since before the age of 22, and mainly due to a medical condition. So that's for family sponsorships, mainly just covering spouses and dependent children and orphan relatives under the age of 18. For that, if you have further questions, IRCC has provided an email address. I will send that out afterwards as part of my information slides or presentation slides. But it's basically the ircc.situationafghanistan.ircc@cic.gc.ca. Those who are applying for permanent residence and including family members overseas as part of their permanent residence application will also be prioritized for processing. And if an Afghan protected person who themselves was recently resettled to Canada, then they can also, and they're applying for one of their dependents. So these two groups of protected persons for permanent residence applications will be prioritized. For temporary residents, those individuals who are currently in Canada with a study permit, temporary worker permit, or a visitor visa, they are able to apply to extend, restore, or renew those documents. And for those, they will prioritize the processing. And if they're applying for a new visitor visa, student permit, or temporary work permit, they have to meet two requirements. The first one, that they're an Afghan national outside of Canada, and the second, that they are an eligible family member of a Canadian citizen permanent resident, meaning they have to be either a spouse or a child, the child of a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, if they're applying for temporary status. But I have to say that this is a little confusing, because for temporary residence, you have to convince the officer that the person will be able to, the applicant will be going back to their country after their visa is completed. So I'm not sure what the government is planning or thinking, what they will be doing with this. But for now, they have said that they will be prioritizing the processing of temporary residence applications by those two groups of Afghans, ones that are currently in Canada, they can renew, restore, and they're applying for renewal, restoration, or extension of their current status. And if they're outside of Canada, then they have to be an eligible family member, and it will be for a new temporary permit, either student, visitor, or worker. In terms of how to get that priority, the priority processing, if the application is being submitted online, the government has asked people to submit the application and then write an email with specific information and send it by email to the same email address, IRCC Situation Afghanistan, IRCC. And again, I'll send that out to with my slides. You send that email there, and you indicate that you want priority processing. If you are submitting a paper application, when you are sending the application, on the envelope, they want you to write in big bold letters, urgent Afghanistan priority. And if this application was already submitted, you would be following the instructions that is for online applications, sending an email with certain information. For some of the applications, another special measure is to waive the fee for certain types of applications. So if a person is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and currently in Afghanistan or another country on their way to Canada, the government will waive the fee for a one-year passport or an urgent travel document, or for permanent resident travel documents, or for proof of Canadian citizenship. For these applications, they will waive fees if the person is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident of Afghan origin and currently in Afghanistan or another country on their way to Canada. And additionally, for Afghan nationals who are immediate family members, and for all of these immediate family members, basically, initially they suggested a spouse, dependent children, and parents, but at this time it's just spouses and dependent children. For those, for immediate family members of those Canadian citizens and permanent residents, they will be waiving biometrics fee, as well as the requirement to have a valid passport or travel document. In order for this to happen, the person must, for the fees to be waived, the person has to be, of course, an Afghan national and be an eligible immediate family member of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and be traveling to Canada with a family member who is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident and currently be in Afghanistan or another country on their way to Canada. So again, they're making it, although it's a special measure to help, but it's very, very specific to waive the fee for biometrics and the requirement to have a valid passport or travel document. And then Afghan nationals who are in other countries, but they have been approved for permanent residence in Canada. Once they are approved for permanent residence in Canada, they receive a confirmation of permanent residence document. So for people who have that, they will waive again biometrics fee and the requirement to have a valid passport or travel document. They need to have a valid confirmation of permanent residence to come to Canada. And if they don't have a valid passport, they will waive that. And they have to be outside of Canada before this is approved or the fees are waived. And Afghan nationals who are in Canada as temporary workers, students, or visitors, for them, they will as well waive the fees if they are currently in Canada as a temporary resident and applying to extend their temporary residence status, renew their work or study permit, restore, and they are also not waiving the requirement to restore your status, temporary status, within 90 days of it expiring. That's currently the requirement for all restoration applications for temporary status. They're waiving that as well. And if a person is applying for a new temporary resident permit as well, because their current one is expiring. For these individuals, they will waive the fee as well as, yes, just waiving the fee. So if they're in Canada, then they just waive the fee. And also for those who have applications for protection under the Immigration Refugee through the Immigration Refugee Board, they're also processing existing files on a priority basis for Afghan nationals. Those are the current measures for the types of applications, different types of applications that will get priority processing or fees waived, or certain requirements such as having a valid passport or travel document waived. The other measure that was introduced to assist Afghan nationals has to do with the 20,000 number that they want to resettle. Although this might be discussed by the second presenter, I'll just briefly go over it to say that the 20,000 individuals that Canada has promised to resettle, and I think yesterday or today they added another 5,000 that were evacuated by the US to be resettled in Canada, covers two groups. The first group are people who assisted the government of Canada through their employment with the embassy or with the armed forces and their families. The second program is the Special Humanitarian Program, which focuses on women leaders, human rights advocates, LGBTI individuals, journalists, and people who assisted Canadian journalists, immediate family members of one of the above that I just mentioned, and extended family members of previously resettled interpreters who assisted the government of Canada. And this includes family members who are still in Afghanistan. Under that second program, like I said, the resettlement will happen first, before I go to how the resettlement has been announced will happen, I would like to mention, sorry, this is the part where I'm a little disorganized. So there are two classes. The way they will resettle the Humanitarian Assistance Program will resettle individuals under who you have, in order to be eligible, they have to belong to one of two classes. The first one are Afghan nationals who assisted the government of Canada through their employment. And my apologies. I may just take 1 minute, sorry. So the group 1 are individuals who are Afghan nationals outside of Afghanistan, and they don't have a durable solution in a third country. This group will include individuals such as women leaders, human rights advocates, journalists. Those individuals will be considered group 1, and group 2 are individuals who are extended family members of someone who helped the government of Canada and has already been resettled to Canada. And the way the program will work is through government assistance resettlement or private sponsorships through Group of 5 or other private sponsorship programs that are currently available, SAH or sponsorship agreement holders or constituent groups through those. The problem with that is you can't, as someone who is assisting or an applicant themselves, cannot access these programs, cannot nominate themselves for resettlement. It has to be done through referrals from the UNHCR or other organizations, and they deal with the government of Canada for those, and individuals cannot really choose where they want to be resettled. But if they have family in Canada, then that will help them resettle here. Outside of that, they do not have special other measures that are unique for Afghan nationals at this time. Evacuations have stopped from inside Afghanistan, and they have told Afghan Canadian citizens of Canada who are of Afghan origin or permanent residents who are still stuck in Afghanistan, they've been told to stay safe, somewhere safe, and wait for further instructions, but to make sure that they keep their information, contact information up to date with Global Affairs Canada. And their information is also posted on the website that I was mentioning, the Immigration Citizenship website under Canada's response to the situation in Afghanistan. So these were some of the issues I was going to cover.
Do you want me to put up the slides now?
Yes. So the next part I will be dealing with is in relation to some fraud and scams or schemes that have been introduced,
okay. So
that are being used.
Yeah, just before we do that, I just want to let everyone know that the session is being recorded, and that by staying, you are consenting to the session being recorded. Now I'm going to share the slides that Razmeen is going to go through.
So maybe slide 2. So this one, this page here, if you look at the website at the top, it says canada.ca. I'm going to be looking at my own slides because it's easier. So on this first one, it says canada.ca. And this page will has a brief description of what to do and how to avoid becoming the victim of fraud. And I will show you one sample and the extent to which this group has gone to defraud people in really desperate situations. So this page, the first page that you are looking at right now, how to recognize fraudulent information, is an actual Canadian immigration page. It's an official page. This one, Government of Canada, this is not an actual Government of Canada website. This is a fraudulent website. And if you look, yes.
Which slide number are you on?
The next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot to do that.
Yeah. So apply
Okay.
for an entry visa, express entry visa.
Yes, right away you can see express entry has nothing to do with refugee protection or the current measures. That's a different program that's available for immigration, has nothing to do with this, but they have sort of imitate that page as much as they could. And I tried today to register. It goes to a page that's not functioning. I tried here it says contact us, and it will take you to a page with an email address and a phone number. I tried calling the phone number. There was no answer. And next slide, please. And if you notice, they have continued with their line. The next page, how to reach them, is this one that I just put up. And this phone number doesn't go anywhere. So it's easy for people to get confused. And their email address is immgca.com. Any Government of Canada immigration related website, email has to have that .ca, canada.ca or cic.gc.ca link at the end. And if it doesn't, it's not an official government website. This was sent to an individual as well from the same website, telling them to pay, and that their profile will be only active for 24 hours. They have to make a payment for registration, and once they make the payment, they will receive a visa PIN code, which will further validate your visa for approval. They called it the next slide will tell you what type of visa they're calling it, and the amount of money. So this is for CVAR or visa PIN to proceed with your humanitarian visa. And there's no Canada humanitarian visa. And there's no, I'm not sure why this person, if this information is actually correct or not, the name and the address and all of that, but it shows the kind of money that they're charging. It's also the same company or the same website. The next slide, they actually send individuals something like this. Canada Immigration, again, entry visa assessment. There's no entry visa, and I'm not sure again what, or humanitarian visa program. So that's what they're advertising, asking for money. Some old forms are being provided. Sorry, Kamana John, can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
So if you look at the form at the bottom, I'm not sure if, usually for immigration forms, you will see this number on the bottom left corner. It will mention the name of the application, the form. So generally an application for permanent residence in Canada, it's called a generic application, and it's IMM 008, but this version is a 08-2002, and this does not look at all like a current application form for permanent residence in Canada. So they're using some old forms that are not official forms. And the next one for medical examination, which is generally a part of any immigration application or refugee protection application, they require medical examinations. If we can go to the next slide, please. Once again, this one mentions Canadian Express entry. And this is the form that is being sent to individuals. These families contacted our office, and what I mentioned when we went through these, clearly they were fraudulent. So I sent them to CCR, which is the Canadian Council for Refugees. They do a refugee advocacy, refugee rights advocacy, and this information was sent to IRCC's Major Investigations Unit, who has now contacted the police, or they're joining forces with police to investigate this company because it has a Canadian address, actually. I also wanted to go to one other, slide 8, if you don't mind, Tamanajan, just show the card. Yes. So they actually sent this card, CVAR, Canada Humanitarian Visa Program card, to the applicant. But thank God they hadn't paid any money at that point. Before they paid any money, they contacted our office and we said to not pay. So just if there is information, if you hear of people getting offers, any request for money should be a red flag if they're requesting money to do this, and as an official of the government. No Canadian government office or official would be asking for money to process the applications. And now with the fee waivers, it's really difficult to cover all these scams. But the examples that have come up, we will be sharing those with immigration and also the police so that they can be taken down, or the sites can be taken down. But asking for money, these type of just double checking with the current official website of CIC, which covers all the available programs for Afghans who have been affected by the recent crisis. So I would say if they're asking for money, especially just creating accounts outside of any money should not be paid to them. And also in order to protect their information, I think there was an article today about someone who had been beaten up by the Taliban, who had posed as officials or people who could help him get a visa to Canada. And he sent the information to them, and he was beaten up. And so I think the only thing I can say is make sure if you're advising anyone, helping anyone, or if you're applying yourself, to please check the canada.ca website that I mentioned earlier. And on there, the special measures or Canada's response to the situation in Afghanistan. That page has the most up-to-date information covering all different measures, as well as any new changes, new updates that happen on that page. So I would check with that. I think I should let the second presenter, those are all the things that I had prepared for presentation, and I will also be answering questions. And I'll pass it on to Tom.
Okay, so now I'm just going to pass the virtual mic to Pantea Jafari, who's going to cover some of the more traditional avenues that were available, as well as some of the information that we have about the new resettlement program. Thank you very much, Razmeen.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Pantea, you're muted.
Sorry, hello?
Yep, we can hear you now.
سلام، شب بخیر به همگی. واقعا متاسفم از شرایطی که پیش اومده. تمام سعیمون رو میکنیم که اطلاعات برسونیم حداقل اگر کار دیگه از دستمون بر نیاد. We will do our best to at least share some information, if nothing else. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm on maternity leave presently, so I'm not at all up to speed on anything specifically geared for the Afghan situation, but wanted to just lend my support and be here for questions, at least if there's anything I can help with. So I will cover some of the traditional programs. I'm happy to speak in Farsi, but I think we've been asked to have the presentation in English, and we'll take some questions in Farsi. اما اگه سوالی دارین میتونین تماس بگیرین حتما. I don't personally take refugee cases at my firm, so please know that in terms of calling us afterwards. I can provide information, but we don't take refugee cases. So The other problem is with everyone's level of anxiety and everything that's going through, it seems kind of academic to go through some of these programs and options, which largely may not be applicable. But given that it's a large group and we don't know what your specific needs are and what your specific questions are, I'm just going to do a really brief overview of some of the refugee programs that are available, and then maybe in the question and answer period, we can dig in a little bit more deeper into any of the specific programs that might be of interest or a potential option for any of you. So again, apologies if this is too academic, but I'm going to provide some background. I'm sure everybody knows that the traditional refugee program requires you to be outside of Afghanistan, residing in some other country and seeking assistance and protection because your life is at risk, whether by the government itself or by people inside the government, inside the country that the government can't protect you from. So most of the programs require you to already be registered with the UNHCR, already be recognized as a refugee by the UNHCR, and then waiting for settlement in a country. And most of these programs are about how you would link up with settlement options. The other avenue, of course, is for you, if you can find a way to get to a border, like the Canadian border, is to make a refugee claim inside, considered inside at the entrance to Canada. And that runs on the same legal principles, but obviously you get to have a direct shot at explaining your situation of risk, and you get some benefits and work authorization and government supports while that process is being taken to demonstrate whether you are in a situation of risk. So I'm going to assume that we're not talking about the border situation, that most people are in or surrounding Afghanistan and looking for some options. So I will again cover those really briefly and take your questions. So for the most part, like I said, that requires you to already be at a starting point of being outside of Afghanistan, which is not the case for most of the people probably you're trying to bring. And then once outside, they also already need to be registered and approved by UNHCR, which is likely also not the case for many. But if they are lucky enough to have that UNHCR certificate and are just waiting for resettlement that's taking a really long time, there are a couple of other things that, so the government, when you get a UNHCR certificate, governments around the world get your profile, your family profile, and then can slowly try to find space for you. For trying to move along faster in that process, there are people you can connect to inside Canada to try to sponsor you to come sooner. Okay, so those are the categories I'm going to talk about. One of those is organizations inside Canada called sponsorship agreement holders. I'm not going to talk about this too much at all, because they only allow one round of applications from these organizations, and that round closed July 30th of this year. So you're not able to reach out to them anyway, so I won't waste your time, but there is such a program. The one that might be most useful for you is something called Group of Five. It requires you to link to someone in Canada, some community member, family, friend, whoever might be the case, and they get together 4 other people that are willing to privately sponsor you, and that means they take on legal and financial obligations, not only for you, but for your whole family unit. So as Razmeen was saying, a family unit is considered you, your spouse, and your dependent children, who are children under the age of 22 or that are dependent on you financially and emotionally over 22 due to some sort of medical reason. So you can't break up a family, you can't sponsor one person individually, it has to be a whole family unit. And so if you find 5 people inside Canada willing to do that, they take on legal obligations for you, so to show you around, to get you settled, to get you housing, to get you bank accounts, and translators where you need it, help you register for school, help you find work, that type of stuff, but also financial obligations. They take on the financial responsibility to be providing for the livelihood of the family unit for 1 year or until you become self-sufficient, whichever is sooner. So if, you know, at a few months in, the main breadwinner of the family gets a job and has an income, then that obligation can be waived. But of the 5 people, at least 3 of them have to be financially supporting. So 3 of them will have to provide their financial background to the government, explain their profile and things like that, and pledge to provide monetary support for the family, while the 2 others can also provide financial support, but minimally they will have to provide physical support, driving you to appointments, driving you to register the kids for school, to get your health card, this, that, and the other. So this is likely the thing that you will be able to work on the most in terms of trying to set up. It is a very long process normally, both filling out the application and then really the processing. And especially with the pandemic, the processing times have slowed a lot. I definitely trust that coming from Afghan nationals, they will be prioritized in the stream. So if you have people in Canada that are willing to provide this kind of sponsorship, that's definitely something to pursue, and try to grow one or 2 people to 5 to do a formal commitment. And they have to have a settlement plan. They have to explain how they're gonna what they're going to do for you when you come, especially if there are special needs inside the family unit. Someone might be pregnant, someone might have a disability. All of that needs to be accounted for and explained how you're going to manage those needs when the family arrives. Another group, another 2 subsets of groups are related to the sponsorship agreement holders. So I'll talk about them, but they might not be as useful again. So constituency groups are, you know, community organizations, like subgroups that a sponsorship agreement holder might authorize to work with them to sponsor a family. But again, that program is closed. And then there's a program called Community Sponsors, which is on the 20,000 announcement. The government seems to be looking to the community sponsor groups to help with the resettlement, so that might be an option. And community sponsors are just like also community organizations. They also will take on financial and legal responsibilities to help settle the family. And they will also need to provide financial profiles and convince the government that they can meet the monetary needs of the family in addition to their own family needs. So they'll have enough additional income to support whatever the size of the incoming family is. And then with the community sponsors, you can have individual co-sponsors. So let's say you have a family member in Canada who wants to sponsor you, but they can't find 4 other people to do the group of 5. So that person can go to a community sponsor and say, listen, I'm willing to be a co-sponsor directly, to put up money, to really do a lot of the resettlement assistance, you know, drive them around, have them live with me, whatever the case is, and just get the formal support of the community sponsor group as well, and then do a joint application. So that might be something that you can work on. And then there's something called a blended referral, and that's something that will move a lot faster, but again, maybe not likely. So for a blended referral, you will already be in contact with IRCC. You will already have been vetted by them and have done medical and security checks. And then they connect with people inside Canada to get you moving here faster. So usually in that program, you're in Canada within 1 to 4 months. And the Canadian government takes on 6 months of the financial responsibility, and then the community individuals and organizations will take up the other 50. And then but that's from IRCC itself. The Canadian government is working with you. The individuals in Canada can also pair with other visa offices called an other visa office referral. And again, you will be known to that other visa office. You will have had some vetting already, and they can then take on financial and legal responsibility for you. That visa office will not do any financial contributions, but again, can help you get here a little bit faster. And then there's something called Urgent Protection Program. Now, I'll come back to this. The Urgent Protection Program is for people who are at particular risk. So usually for people that are a little bit more high profile, that are a little bit more well known to the Taliban or to other sources of risk. And in that situation, you're usually assessed within 24 to 48 hours, and you're usually in Canada within 3 to 4 or 5 days. So the whole process is a week at most, because you're just that imminently at risk. You still would have to get yourself to a UNHCR office to get an assessment. And again, it's envisioned for really, I'm assuming, rare circumstances. But when you hear the verbiage of the 20,000, so there isn't any information really that I can find that's released about the 20,000 Afghans they want to bring in. It seems like they're talking about basically a confluence of all of these programs just expedited to try to bring them in sooner. But when they use language about people at more risk, people that might be more targeted, like women at risk of being raped or the LGBTQ community and things like that, it seems like they're talking about kind of an urgent protection program. So there might be room for it to be really, really speedy processing, or something of an in-between. Maybe what they're looking at is people coming through the other programs, but targeting the people at risk for super special and more timely processing. So the particulars of that announcement is not clear as to whether it's going to be a specific program with its own criteria. And anybody on the call, if you have better information, please ante in, because like I said, I'm on mat leave and I didn't get a lot of time to do a ton of research, but from what I can see, there really isn't a lot of details announced. So it's not clear whether, like I said, there's going to be specific criteria to qualify, and whether they will accept Afghans that are still in Afghanistan versus the normal requirement for them to be outside. It seems like, because there's been no actual talk on this, so usually this would be a huge talking point when the community is up in arms and extremely anxious and stressed about the reality on the ground, which is people can't get out of Afghanistan. If they were envisioning accepting people from inside that haven't had a chance to go to a neighboring country and connect with UNHCR, I think that would be an immediate talking point, especially in an election time. And the fact that that isn't a talking point suggests to me that that's not what they're considering. So it suggests to me that the program will be made up of people outside of Afghanistan, and most likely people that are already either in the system on these programs, on these sponsorship type programs, or that apply under these programs. I don't imagine that they're going to necessarily create a new system, and especially so quickly. It just will probably be relaxed evidentiary requirements, because you won't have the infrastructure to go get new IDs and birth certificates and things like that, and likely faster processing, but we will see. Anything else? I think that's what I was to cover before we move to questions.
Thank you very much, Pantea. So now we're going to go into questions. We're first going to...
Apologies. Yep. Just one other thing I wanted to mention about any of these programs, that if you have, so remember the family unit, it consists of you, a spouse, and dependent children. and sometimes even children of your dependent children. So if any family member is missing right now that you don't know where they are, but they are part of your family, make sure you declare them on the application, because if they are later found and discovered, you have a 1-year window from when you get here to sponsor them as it's called a non-accompanying family member, to sponsor them to join you still in Canada. So please make sure you don't omit anyone just because you don't know where they are. And a lot of times I find they say, oh, I didn't name them because then they wouldn't be able to get medical and criminal, and it was going to hold up my application and stuff, but then that will impact your ability to sponsor them after the fact. So make sure you declare them as family members, but just note them as non-accompanying because they're not, their whereabouts isn't known or distinguishable right now. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That was good information. So we're going to go into questions now. Razmeen and Pantea will do their best to answer your questions. First, we're going to address the questions that came in before the presentation today. The first question there is, how do I know if, sorry, let me pull it up. How do we know if we're a victim of fraud? That's a question that Razmeen went through a little bit before. The biggest factors, I guess, would be making sure that you're on the Canada.ca website. Any request for money is an issue right off the bat, given a lot of the fees that have been waived. So I hope that answers that question. The other question that we had was, what are the options of Afghan nationals, specifically diplomats, who are in third countries but do not have access to UNHCR or an embassy? And a sub-question is what are our options if we can get to Pakistan? Pantea, would you be able to address that question?
Not necessarily specifically of diplomats. If the question is talking about Canadian diplomats abroad, well, then there are, of course, as Canadian citizens and PRs, they will have priority to be picked up and brought back. If we're talking about Afghan nationals that are diplomats, maybe they can try under the Urgent Protection Program or a visa office referral, like a blended or another visa office. I unfortunately don't do these cases, so I don't have any practical knowledge or experience to offer. But they will obviously be faring better than people that are still on the ground, unfortunately.
Okay. Razmeen, John, are you there?
Yes.
So I think, what are your thoughts on the question? So what are the options of Afghan nationals who are in third countries but don't have access to the UNHCR Canadian Embassy?
Unfortunately, like Pantea said, we don't have these special measures, and new measures really aren't that special or that new. For people who are diplomats, like other citizens outside of Canada in a third country, the option would be to get to a country where they can register with the government as not register, apply for temporary protection with the government of that country. Or if UNHCR is processing refugee claims, then UNHCR, they have to be approved for refugee status or get refugee status document showing they are accepted as a refugee, and then be sponsored. For people inside Afghanistan, really the only option at this time is if they are married to a Canadian citizen PR, or if they're the children of Canadian citizen or a PR, those applications will be processed on a priority basis. That's it. They're not adding new options for people who are at this level of risk right now. And additionally, for people who are outside Canada, like Pantea also pointed out, the 20,000 will be resettled. Resettling is generally happening, it happens from outside of Afghanistan and outside of Canada, obviously. They will be brought in either as government assisted refugees under GAR, and that will be initiated by the government themselves. We can't say, well, we would like this person who is in this difficult situation. I have a client right now whose nephew, 17-year-old, is by himself in Turkey, and they just got there a few days after the Taliban took over. He was robbed and he has no documents. So for somebody like that, the only option is to try and get to a place where they can register with UNHCR as a minor, or somewhere where the government will process it a little faster, because Turkey is taking forever to process these refugee status determination documents, years. And Canada or Turkey has not introduced or announced any special measures for that. We still need, for group of 5 sponsorships, we still need to have that document that's required. It's called a refugee status determination document. It's required for the applicant and 5 sponsors who are in Canada in the same area, having sufficient income and ability to meet the other needs of the refugee applicants for 12 months after their arrival in Canada. So those were in existence before, and they're still in place. So 20,000 or 25,000 or 30,000, it depends on how many sponsors we have. My suggestion is to focus mainly on private sponsorships, because the government will not have the capacity, and sponsorship agreement holders have closed their program for this year. They may not have the capacity to take on so many applications. And that 20,000 is not 20,000 families, it's 20,000 individuals, which is nothing compared to the number of people who are in desperate situations. So at this point, for diplomats, yes, they will be treated like anybody else. If they're in a third country, they have to get somewhere, unfortunately, where they can register or obtain that document showing they were accepted as refugee or granted international protection. I do want to point out that we're still in the beginning phases of all of this as we're trying to process the information. The government of Canada is also trying to go through the different options available. I think the election is giving it a bit more urgency. Maybe if we can put pressure on the government or on our members of parliament to say, we have to get new measures, actual new measures to assist these families. They're in desperate situations outside of Canada, where UNHCR has ceased processing and issuing those documents in many countries. I think in Pakistan and Iran, they're going to maybe start again. Tajikistan has said that they will accept about 100,000 refugees. But again, getting to Tajikistan, getting to those neighboring countries is also at this time very risky. So Canada's recommendation, suggestion to Canadian citizens and those who are still in Afghanistan at risk is stay safe, wait until, and that email address that I will post here again, send us an email with your information, get to a third country if you can safely, and then start a process from there. But there's no special program that says if you, because of the current situation, we have this special visa or this special program which is specific to Afghans. So we're still going through the same pathways that existed before and that exist for everyone. Afghans are not the only ones who require this refugee status determination document. It's required by any refugee applicant from a third country outside of Canada. Normally, they have to make an application, a claim inside Canada or at the border. But if they're outside of Canada, then it has to be through government-assisted resettlement or group private sponsorship programs or blended, as Pantea was explaining. I think that's all I'll say for now, but stay hopeful, please. Maybe there will be other new programs. We have to just keep the pressure on the government to do this.
I'm gonna add to that unfortunately the situation on the ground is extremely difficult but also we're getting lots and lots of calls about, oh, I want to do investor now, or I want to do student visa now and stuff. You have to know that those are not going to be processed in any timely fashion to be of help, and certainly most of them won't be approved anyway. Any application for temporary residence, I would say flat out won't be approved, because anytime they are assessing a temporary application, their biggest concern is you're going to get to Canada and make a refugee claim because you don't want to return to your country. And with the situation in Afghanistan, it's 100% sure that you don't want to return to Afghanistan. So getting a temporary resident application approved under the circumstances, I would say, is literally impossible. I would definitely advise you not to put your money and time and effort into it. And a permanent resident application, which has more possibility, realistically isn't going to get done in any speed or fashion, both in terms of getting the necessary documents from you to make the application, and also in the processing, right? The process is going to take forever and ever with COVID and stuff. So unfortunately, be practical and be realistic in those efforts. There was another thing I was going to say based on what Razmeen said, which slips my mind right now. I will come back to it.
Thank you both for your answers. It was very helpful.
Oh, sorry. It was towards what you can do on the Canadian side. The biggest thing that we need to get volume on, especially in an election period, is that promises to help Afghan refugees, resettlement efforts, it does nothing really for you, because if a person has gotten out of Afghanistan, they've largely escaped a lot of risk already. You know, like, of course they're still at risk, but they're at risk if they go back, not in that moment. The biggest threat is on the ground, and that's something that nothing has been done towards. Like Razmeen was saying, there's no new program that's been announced, and that's kind of what's necessary, especially in a situation where the Afghanis can't come out of the country to go to a third country to do the normal processes that's expected. There needs to be some sort of solution, and it's extremely difficult. I don't wish it on any Prime Minister or Minister of Citizenship and Immigration to try to grapple with, because there's a lot of security concerns, and you can't vet the person, you don't have proper documentation, there isn't any structural government system for you guys to get documents for them to be able to vet security risks through Interpol or whatever the case might be. So it's really scary to try to vet who comes in and who doesn't, but that's what needs to really happen to be helpful. And so that's what I think, especially in an election time, people can really raise the most stink about to try to get some movement on.
Okay, thank you. So there were a number of questions about children, and one of the questions was, what is happening to unaccompanied minors or babies that have gotten to flights to Canada? Whichever one of you wants to answer.
The general information, the very, very little information, is that they will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And generally what happens is, if there's a minor without an adult who is a family member or a relative, then they are assigned to a designated representative who will be representing or protecting the interests of that minor. I think that there will be, they might get the Office of the Child Guardianship involved as well in some provinces, but it will be, at this point, it's just such an unusual situation, because normally they come with some relative or they have somebody here. And if they have nobody here, then the government will assign that, I think through one of the government organizations, Children's Aid, or the Office of the, I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but they deal with guardianships being appointed, guardians being appointed for children who are minors and without an adult, a family or relative in Canada.
And especially the biggest problem will be that some of the minors will not have identity documents when they arrive, I imagine. Again, I don't know specifically, but what I would recommend for anyone who has sent a child on one of these flights without whereabouts and things like that, contact that special Afghan email address, provide specifics of the child, description, photos if possible, try to send the identifying documents now, try to notify the government of someone on the ground that's a family or a friend that might be able to assist, that might be able to take guardianship over the child until things get sorted out. Because again, I have no idea, but what I would imagine based on, you know, just common sense thinking out loud, is that those children will likely be in some sort of a foster system arrangement until something can happen. And foster systems are generally not pleasant overall, and especially when you have a language and cultural barrier, especially when you're coming from complete shock and trauma of being displaced from your home and your family and your country. So definitely a private home is what that child will need, and the most you can do to try to get that child identified and into a home of even the most remote person that you might know through a friend of a friend, a friend, a friend, a friend, friend, would be better. And I'm sure there are lots of people willing to open up their homes to a child presently. So I'm sure you can go outside of your community. That's what, in a way, social media can be helpful for. I haven't seen this yet, but if I saw a post come through of someone saying that literally we need a home for a child that's coming from X and family isn't with them, like even I would open up my home, right? So I think just if that has happened, and I don't know how often it is, something to think about.
Okay. And kind of on the lines of the same questions, one of the questions that we have gotten repeatedly is how can we go about sponsoring or adopting orphans if it's a possibility now?
I looked into this, and again, there's not a lot of information because it's not an area of practice that we usually, as the refugee immigration lawyers, that we get involved in. But I'm sending the link. Each province deals with adoptions, international adoptions differently. So depending on the province where you are in Canada, you can go through that website, and I am sending in the chat the link to the Ontario website for international adoptions. They have their own process, and you can get more information about how to do that. Unfortunately, what happens if the child is in Afghanistan, again, you have to go through the adoptions process before you can actually sponsor them as an adopted child.
Yeah, and the adoption process, again, like everything else, bureaucratic work, is an extremely long process. You have to do a formal adoption first, and then start the immigration process of sponsorship, which can take a very long time. And again, people on the ground here that are looking for what to do, where to go, what to do to kind of get more awareness and more resources available. That's another point that I would highly recommend the Afghan organizations raise as talking points for the leadership and for the elections, because there should be some sort of temporary program for at least the children on the ground here for something called guardianship. Okay, legal adoption is going to take an extremely long time. Let them at least take guardianship in the meantime, especially Afghan community members, so that the child can have at least a cultural and language similarity to what they came from, even if there's no familial bond otherwise. That would be a lot better than them being in some sort of a government system and run by English language, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the other questions that we gotten was what is happening to the cases that were already submitted to the IRCC prior to the Taliban taking over? I believe that Razmeen John already addressed it in her presentation, which is that they're expediting these cases and making them go through the system a little faster, which is a bit of good news that we have gotten on this end.
You have to make a request for, sorry.
Yep,
you have to make a request it should be prioritized. So if the application was already previously submitted, then you will have to send information about the application, and I'll send you that link again where what to contain. So when you send the email, you'll have to provide certain information, and then send it to a specific email address to request prioritized processing.
And again,
I will send that link.
And again, on the front of the questions regarding what you can do in Canada, that's the additional thing I would definitely raise in Canada, especially by the Afghan organizations, that any application in process should have a waiver of, because right now on the ground, you're not going to be able to do medical exams. You're not going to be able to get somewhere to do biometrics and things like that, things that will be holding up those applications that are already in queue. So for some sort of a specific program that gives a waiver or a deferral of those needs and lets the person come to Canada temporarily in the meantime and let them be here during the processing, that's definitely something that can be advocated for.
Okay, great. One of the last questions that we kind of have gotten previously before today's chat was, how can we get sponsored by an organization since our family members do not have money to do private sponsorship?
I want to make clear that it's not the Afghan nationals that need to have money for their sponsorship. It's the people in Canada that need to have money and show financial ability to sponsor them. But if the question is that their family in Canada doesn't have the money, then that's when you're looking to, like the sponsorship agreement holders and things like that, for which the intake this year is full. So unfortunately, the only alternative would be to try to go to a community sponsor group. And there's a list of all of these on the IRCC website, by the way, about what organizations have these designations already. And try to link with a community sponsor and try to convince them to take the case. So when you don't have the funds, you have to get an organization to do it. And because they have such a huge influx of requests, that also is an uphill battle. I'm sorry to be like bearer of bad news on top of bad news, but I'm just trying to be very realistic and practical.
Okay, thank you. So we'll get to some of the questions that we've received today through the chat group. What we've tried to do is to kind of group questions together so that we can address them as one. One of the questions that keep coming up is about the requirements for spousal sponsorships. What's required if they're unable to get documents proving their marriage. If virtual marriages are something that will be accepted between a Canadian citizen and an Afghan national. So what are your thoughts on that front?
Razmeen, you want me to take that or? Okay, I'll take that. Or she's gone.
Go ahead.
So as of a few years ago, the government of Canada has announced that it will no longer accept proxy marriages. So the two people have to be physically present for the marriage to be recognized by Canada. But they can attempt to do what we did at the beginning of the pandemic, which is we filed sponsorships and said, X and Y document we can't get because government offices are closed and will be provided as soon as possible. Interestingly, almost all of those applications that we filed at the beginning of the pandemic were accepted for processing, and some of them had like significant document issues. But the only one that our office received returned was one that was missing the PR photos. So I don't understand. So anytime you're going to file an application incomplete, you're going to have problems and risks that some entry-level pencil pusher is going to say, oh, it's incomplete, and just return it and not understand the gravity of the circumstances. If you were to do that, I would highly recommend that you simultaneously send an email to the specific email outlining the circumstances and why you've done it, and also then make sure you outline that what is missing, why it's missing, when it might be expected in the actual application that's being submitted. Link them together. Make sure that the government knows of the circumstances, and hope and pray that you don't hit some, pencil pusher that we'll return it. I wouldn't wait for the document to arrive, though. I would definitely go ahead and file it.
Okay, so what type of evidence, I guess, do you need to provide in support of your marriage and spousal sponsorship, like photographs, things like that, or?
Actually, sorry, Razmeen, I'll take that as well, because I needed to complete the answer to the last question. So in terms of where you can't get married or you can't get proof of a marriage, then you might want to consider applying under some of the other categories, like the sponsorship, the common law, or even the conjugal program. And I'll explain briefly the difference. So Canada recognizes 3 types of marriage-like situations. One is a traditional marriage. You have a marriage certificate and you got married at a nikah or whatnot. And then the second is something called common law. You're not married, but you've lived together for at least 1 year. And then the third is something called conjugal, where you haven't lived together and you're not married, but you've been together for more than a year. And the reason why you're not living together or married is because there's some sort of a legal or risk impediment to you doing so. So maybe there's a religious difference, maybe there's a family strife and you wouldn't be allowed, things like that. And that needs to be really well explained for that category to be accepted. But so if you had, let's say, a video marriage, a proxy marriage that's not recognized as a marriage, you would try to then fit yourself into one of those other categories, legal definitions of one of those other categories, either if you've been able to live together for a year, but if not, then the other program. And then under the conjugal, especially presently, while normally you might be able to have time to get married or live together to qualify for some of the other programs, the legal impediment that you can explain as to why you're applying under that program could be the situation presently. So it's not something that I've done in the past, but it's something I would definitely entertain doing now. So normally under that category, you're looking at situations where even going forward, if you waited a year or whatever, you couldn't get married, you couldn't live together because of this like permanent bar to it, the religious difference or whatever the case is, or, you know, same-sex couples living in a country where you're just not allowed. But in the present situation, I would try to rely on the temporary situation and the collapse of the government as a reason to try to peg myself into those categories. And then the evidence overall for sure is photos of your relationship, but because those can so often be fabricated, more so communication logs, so text messages, WhatsApp, IMO, Viber, Facebook, whatever you're using to communicate, those logs to demonstrate you're in daily contact with each other. Letters from family and friends goes a long way to show that they know about your relationship, they know about the hardship you've gone through. If you've had a period where you've lived together, certainly mail at each other's address. Some of these things obviously don't apply to Afghanistan, like you really don't have utility bills necessarily that will be available with both your names on it and things like that. So whatever when you're doing these applications, there's a very specific list. They write this type of evidence, this type of evidence, and whatever it is that you can't provide, either it just doesn't exist in your country or because of the circumstances you can't provide it, you should just write an explanation as to why you can't provide it and put that explanation where that document should be.
Okay. And one more question on the spousal sponsorship program. So the person that you're sponsoring, can they be inside Afghanistan or do they have to be outside of Afghanistan for spousal sponsorships?
They can definitely be inside, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, for spousal sponsorships?
Yes.
Yeah.
They don't have to be inside Afghanistan. They could be in another country as long as the marriage took place.
Yeah, I think the question was whether they have to leave Afghanistan if they are inside of Afghanistan.
Oh,
yeah.
They don't.
No, it's
Sorry,
not the refugee program. They can definitely be inside Afghanistan.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was on the mistake was on my part. I don't think I asked that clear enough. Okay, so I think that covers the issue of spousal sponsorships. Thank you very much, Pantea, for your expertise on that. One of the other questions that we received was, procedurally, where should hopeful applicants start their applications? Should they reach out to Canadian immigration, refugee lawyers, or go on their own via the government website?
That's a tough one. I'll put my 2 cents in. Razmeen, please follow. You know, even the government website says, oh, you don't need a representative and stuff, but in reality, and like I said, I don't take refugee cases, so I'm not saying this for you to come hire me, but in reality, there is so much ambiguities and difficulties and technicalities in the immigration process, and every little mistake can cost you such a long time to fix and to follow up that, you know, I would 100% say get someone to make sure you're doing it correctly, you're doing it right, and you're not going to waste any time. Because even, let's say, you know, we had a client that came to us because they had done their personal history on the Schedule A form. It's a form that you need to explain 10 years of your life, basically. And then you need to know that it takes a long time for an officer to get to your application. And when they do, if there's a missing information, if you're lucky, they'll send you an email and say, I don't have X, send me X in the next 30, 60, 90 days. But then you go to the bottom of the pile. So even though it was one line that was missing, a period of like 2 months was unaccounted for when they were traveling, that meant they didn't get back to being reviewed for another like year, right? So too much is at stake, I'm sure, for a lot of you. And I know the Canadian currency, like paying in Canadian currency is like so difficult and so expensive, but it might be worth it for sure.
If I could just add that it also depends on the type of application you're doing. So for those who were inside Afghanistan and who had, or outside Afghanistan, who had worked with the government of Canada, an email address was provided. They were asked to send specific information and their documents to that email address, and then the government would send back instructions to them specifically. They had, I think for those, they had simplified the process, which they could hopefully for others too. But at this point, like Pantea said, what I have done is people who contacted me, those who had difficulty explaining their situation in English, I drafted the text of what should be sent and provided the email address to them and said, you can send this and these documents to this email address. And if you need help when they contact you again with instructions, then I can assist with preparing or following up on that. But not as a representative. I've been helping just on the side for people who are not able to write their own email in English. So yes, I would say if you want to sponsor, definitely at least either for a review or consultation, meet with an immigration lawyer. If it's a refugee sponsorship application, absolutely, you have to talk to a lawyer because there are lots of requirements. And something that immigration has been doing lately is just in sending back applications, if anything is missing as incomplete, sometimes without even letting us know what is missing. So it's important, if you don't want to waste, if you don't want the process to be delayed, if you want it to be done the first round, then it might help. If you don't have the money to hire a lawyer for the whole process, you could, depending on the lawyer, you could hire them just to review your completed application for an hourly fee or something smaller. So that's what I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to our next question is, what are the options for those not registered with the UNHCR? I guess assuming that they're outside of Afghanistan, what's their best alternative?
So it's not just being registered with the UNHCR, it's actually having a document that says you have international protection. So you have already been accepted, or the person has been accepted or approved as a refugee, as a convention refugee, then the private sponsorships or other groups might get involved to sponsor. Usually the group of 5 is the one that requires that document for the applicant, for the refugee applicant. Sponsorship agreement holders don't require that. And I think constituent groups also don't require the refugee applicant to have that. So that may be an area for families who don't have that document to find a constituent group. I am going to send the link to the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. It's an organization, I guess, a program that's funded jointly by IRCC and I think certain other groups. What they do is they provide a lot of information and training about different types of refugee sponsorship programs and for different countries, what types of documents, everything is there. It's really, really helpful. And if you are considering sponsoring or creating groups to sponsor refugees, I would strongly recommend that you review this website, contact them. They are wonderful people. They will always get back to you with very helpful information. And that's the link that I just sent. It's rstp.ca.
Okay, thank you, Razmeen. So we covered that. The next question is, what kind of documents do you need as a refugee and what to take with you? So passport, visa, national ID, what are your thoughts?
Pantea, you want me to take this or?
Sure, go ahead. I mean, you need as much documents as you can gather before you leave. Things like your employment history, your educational background, birth certificates for all family members, obviously passports, expired passports, things attesting to your travel history, because things might come up with, clearance requests, things like that. Anything about medical conditions, all kinds of status documents, marriage certificates, things like that. Anything government issued, 100%. And some of the other things you can maybe try to get down the line, like employment history and stuff, but especially educational records is really hard to get once you leave the country. Police clearance, if you have that. The good thing about police clearances is if you get one if you manage to have one before you leave the country, then it doesn't matter how long passes. If you don't return to that country, it's still valid. So even though normally it might be, in some countries it expires in 1 month, in 3 months, and 6 months. But if you've left the country and haven't returned, that validity will stay. So definitely, if you can, attempt to get a police clearance before you go. Not present for Afghanistan, of course, there's no functioning government system to do that. But yeah, as much as you can possibly get that you might not recognize that might be helpful, you'll see sometimes you can't. Even things like, again, not necessarily for Afghanistan, but like rental agreements, contracts you've signed, things like that, because they can, you don't understand, but when you have to piece together your life for the last 10 years, unexpectedly, where you were, what you were doing, where you were living, those details don't just stay in your mind. So the more documents you have to try to piece that together, the easier time that you'll have. There have been situations where no matter what we do, we can't piece that puzzle together. And so we write an affidavit instead saying like, we're not sure, or sometimes it was like more nomadic, like you were moving around too much to try to get concrete addresses for that period. But whatever you manage to take with you, and especially in the present age, at least take photos of it if you can't take the physical documents with you. Original documents definitely try to take with you, but other documents where it's already a print or something that you don't necessarily need to take.
Okay. Anything to add, Razmeen, John?
Add a little bit. So normally in order to be accepted or granted refugee protection, you have to prove certain things. One, you have to prove your identity, which includes your citizenship, if you have any identity that's religious, your fears based on your religious identity, your ethnic identity, your gender. Those types of things are also helpful to have to prove those identities. So passport will prove or Tazkira for Afghanistan will prove that you are from that country, a citizen of that country. And then this next part, which shows that you're at risk for a specific reason. For that reason, you have to have documentation that shows, yes, I was a teacher, a female teacher at this school, and the school was attacked, and people know that I'm a teacher at that school. Taliban will find me and they will target me and my family. Or I was a student at this school that was bombed. I'm a member of a religious minority and my family has been active. I have a client who had a music store and Taliban are opposed to that. So anything that you are claiming is putting you at risk individually should be highlighted. But for refugees from outside of Canada, what happens is you are either a member of a convention refugee class or a member of a asylum class. I forget the words, it's late in the day. Is for the second class of refugees, it's not necessarily that you personally were affected, but you're part of a group or a group of people who are targeted. So right now, although the government has identified women activists, women leaders, minority groups, and journalists as people being at risk in Afghanistan, they have always been at risk for the last 20 years, for the last 30 years. So those individuals will still, as long as they have similarly situated other individuals who are in similar situation, you can show through reports, news articles that they're at risk. That also means that you can support your claim saying, because I'm a journalist, because I'm this or that, I'm also at risk.
Okay, I'm just reading some of the questions and there may be some confusion, so I just want to clarify it. If a group of 5 sponsors an Afghan family, does that Afghan family, do they have to be deemed a refugee by a UNHCR office?
Absolutely, and each member of that family has to specifically be recognized by UNHCR.
Okay, and one of the follow-up questions was, how do you go and get recognized by UNHCR? I'm assuming that you go to a UNHCR office in the foreign state that you're at, but you guys are the experts, so perhaps you can advise.
Sure, I'll take that. So you have to present yourself at a UNHCR office outside of Afghanistan. It definitely has to be a third country. There's a long process. You fill out paperwork, you fill out information, all the documents that we were just discussing, you would gather and help support. They will do an interview with you. It's usually a whole day long. They do an interview about your circumstances, how you came to be at risk, how you know that you're at risk or you think you are, and what you have to try to prove that you are. And then based on that, it goes back and there gets to be a determination depending on the UNHCR office and the volume, that determination, and depending on the priority and situation of risk. So in the urgent protection program, for example, that assessment is done within 24 to 48 hours, whereas in some other high volume offices like Turkey, that could take weeks and months, right? And then once they do the assessment based on the documents that you have and the explanations that you've provided, and any like corroborating witnesses or anyone else that can be contacted relating to it, they'll make an assessment. And that if they deem that you are legitimately and truly at risk if you return to Afghanistan, then they recognize you as a person in need of protection. And that's the status document that we've been talking about. And when you get that confirmation, that's when the game starts in terms of a government or a private individual or organization that's sponsoring you to come to that country. So everything starts with that designation, which can take as long as it takes. And then once you have that designation, and unfortunately, there are people who have had that designation for years and years and years, and they're still waiting for a government or
a group or individual to sponsor them, especially out of Turkey, which had a really high influx of refugees, both from Syria, from inside Turkey, and other neighboring countries. It has such a high volume presently that there are people who have been recognized as needing protection that I know of, at least waiting upwards of 7 years waiting for a resettlement in a country. So it's an unfortunately long process.
Okay, thank you. So just on the G5 program, one of the, I guess, last questions was if you can be part of more than one application for G5. I'm not sure if they're asking from the sponsor side or if they're asking from the applicant side. So if you can answer both,
Sure.
that would be great.
On the applicant side, no, absolutely not. You can and should only have one application pending your entire family group. On the sponsor side, I'm not aware of any specific sort of limit, like them specifically saying you can't sponsor more than one person or family. But of course, you need to be financially able to cover your own expenses, your own dependents. So if you have a spouse, children, whatever, to cover your own living costs, and the family that you've already sponsored sufficiently demonstrate that you've done that and can do that unless for you to be able to go on to another. I would imagine, and I've never seen it, I would imagine at the same time is probably not advisable. But if, let's say, last year I sponsored a group and now my 1 year is up, then I can definitely go back and sponsor again now and everything. And that actually builds your credibility because it shows that you were able to sufficiently manage their needs without any problems. But again, I'm not aware of a legal bar to it being at the same time. I just think practically it's probably not all that likely that an individual can sponsor two families.
Okay. One of the other questions that I see in the chat group is if the dependent child is 21 at the start of the application, but they turn 22 while the application is processed, what happens to them? Are they still included in the application?
Yeah, so there's something called a lock-in date. So the government of Canada locks in the facts of the eligibility requirements at the date that they receive a PR application. So if you were 21 at the time that your application for PR was submitted, then for all intents and purposes, that should mean you have no problem and are allowed to still be sponsored as part of the family group. But Razmeen, you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it. The lock-in date is what we need to look at depending on when the application was submitted. But anything that's being submitted now will, for the person who's 21, they will be locked in as 21 as a dependent. So even if they grow and the processing takes longer than a year or two, which normally they do, then they will still be part of that application as a dependent.
Okay.
But things could get complicated if that person down the line then gets married and has further dependents and things like that. So just be mindful of that.
Okay.
Get married.
So one of the other questions was whether we can look up where UNHCR offices are online.
Absolutely.
If
Absolutely.
Okay.
They're all listed.
Okay, if you guys have the link to where people can look that up and can share it, that would be great. In terms of I think we just have.
I think we were talking about preparing a one-pager fact sheet for everyone after, so we'll definitely, all the links that Razmeen has been sharing, we'll put that on a page and email out to all the participants.
Yeah, so just for...
I'm promising that you will do that on your
behalf. Thank you. Well, it's a good thing we already planned on doing it. Right. But yeah, it's so afterwards we'll create a one-pager with relevant information that we talked about, and we'll include some of these links, and we'll put the link for where you can look up a UNHCR office on that fact sheet. That makes sense. So one of the other questions that we have is, when you say that we need to be financially sufficient, how much is the income threshold for each sponsor? Do you know, or is it different depending on how many people you're sponsoring?
Yeah, it's definitely different based on how many people are in your family versus how many people are in the family that you're sponsoring. There are application guides that explain this stuff in more detail, which we can also put in that fact sheet.
Okay. I'm just quickly going through the chat here. One of the other questions is, can an Afghan national with residency from another country, such as Turkey, fall under any category for sponsorship, or will they be considered individuals with durable solutions in a third country?
Razmeen, you want me to take that, or you're going to take it?
Sure. Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Was it permanent status, or what kind of status exactly?
So it says residency. I'm not sure if it's permanent residency or not. Perhaps Mariam Jalali, you can clarify if it's permanent residency or they're just living in Turkey, because I'm assuming that permanent residency, yeah, permanent residency.
So I guess it would depend if they can obtain the similar rights as a citizen of Turkey. There are certain basic rights that they have to have access to, just like other citizens of Turkey, and actually a pathway to getting citizenship in that country. Then that's a durable solution. But if they can't, then they don't have a durable solution. Most countries don't issue that type of protection, I think, including Turkey. They don't. You would have to look at the citizenship rules for each of those countries that are not like the ones who are a part of the convention in full, granting refugee status and then permanent residency and then full rights as a citizen. So
and
those
also
are considered.
Also on that front, if you do have residency in a third country and you can prove that you are also at risk in that country, that can also be a basis. So you need to be demonstrating risk at any country where you can legally live, but that there's some risk. So if that also exists in Turkey for you for whatever reason, then that you might still be able to claim asylum.
Okay. So one of the questions that were asked is, how will they give spouse or other private sponsorship visa? Online, or they have to go to another country? And how long will it take? And then this person's partner has done the biometric and medical checkup. The case is approved, but there has been no response.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. So traditionally and always, there needs to be a counterfoil issued inside the person's passport. You don't physically need to present, but someone needs to physically present on your behalf. So we deal with a lot of Iranian nationals. So they're like travel agencies that will take your passport to the embassy, submit it for you, and then bring it back. And it takes about a week or so turnaround. Before pandemic, now maybe sometimes 2. But again, on the Canadian advocacy side, that's something I would add to the list, because you're not going to have agencies and organizations that can take your passport to a neighboring country and bring it back to you safely. So the getting of counterfoils in your passport is going to be next to impossible, even when everything else is approved and you're ready to come. So there really needs to be some special exemptions in place in these kinds of situations. It's not specific to Afghanistan. It happens with many countries, unfortunately, cyclically. But so there needs to be something advocated for on that front.
Okay, thank you very much. It's almost 7. We have one more question. Yep.
Okay, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
What I wanted to add to that was the confirmation of permanent residence will be emailed to the person or the person's representative, and then they can use that to request a travel document or instructions on how to get the actual visa in their travel document. But the confirmation will be issued by email.
Razmeen, just to confirm, so in my experience, the confirmation of PR electronically comes to those inside Canada that would normally be presenting at an IRCC office, but where the person is overseas, it's still a counterfoil, and that is issued at the port. I've never seen yet in the because this is a pandemic issue, by the way, guys. In the pandemic, instead of going in person, they've been issuing it by email. But during the pandemic, I've never seen that issued to someone overseas for them to come. Has that been your experience?
The only experience I've had is with people who are being sponsored in the group of 5. They have received co-PRs, but they are not able to. They weren't able to travel due to COVID, and now they under this program they're saying that they may facilitate the issuance of travel documents for those who have valid co-PRs issued to them, and they're outside of Afghanistan.
Okay. Okay. So we only have a few minutes left. We will likely wrap this up around 7:55 or so. So I wanted to just devote the last 4 minutes. We've kind of touched base on this throughout the presentation, but what we can do as a community to get Canada to take more action on the current initiative, on the current crisis, given that the initiative so far is, you know, based on what we've talked about, there's not a lot of details, it's not really informative, the number we don't know, it's changing. So what are your thoughts on those fronts?
Not much to say, I guess, but it is election time. That's what I focus on. And this is the best time to put some pressure. Right now, they're not going to make any major changes because they've called an election, the current government. But hopefully, as part of their campaigning, as part of their promises for the election, they will add, I guess there was news that the Liberal Party has already said that they will resettle an extra 20,000 in addition to the 20,000 and the 5,000 that they have agreed to resettle. Still very low number. We have to put pressure on our MPs asking for waiver of the RSD document, refugee status determination document from other countries. This will allow a lot of people to sponsor family members, loved ones, or even just community members faster. So the applicants are not sitting somewhere waiting in a place where they won't get that document in years. Additionally, I think inside Canada, if as community members, we can organize groups of 5 who can sponsor refugees, that would also assist. Just keep the pressure on the government to, it's really sad because in my opinion, the international community may not be as interested in Afghanistan as a political issue anymore. Whatever was the international community was able to get out of it has been taken out. And at this point, once the US government says we're not interested anymore, we don't care, then the other governments will slowly say the same thing. So my suggestion, my recommendation is to focus on private sponsorship and forming groups to sponsor not just the family members. I think if you have sufficient income, you can sponsor more than one applicant or be part of more than one application, as long as you have sufficient income. There is a table, the RCP will give you the link, that website will give you the link to the guide for sponsoring groups of 5, through groups of 5, and the cost of sponsoring the number of refugees from 1 to whatever. It's all explained there. That's all I have to say in terms of what we can do, is just to keep the pressure on, because the government may not be interested anymore, especially after the election.
I would add that I definitely think there should be really fierce advocacy and lobbying as much as possible. You know, petitions, we don't think go a long way, but sometimes they can, especially if there's enough signatures on it at an election time tied to people's postal code that show their writing. So I would encourage especially Afghan organizations that represent a larger part of the community, and other, not just Afghan, but other allied organizations to get together, to mobilize, to demonstrate outside of these election campaign things. Like it was on the news the other day that Trudeau got haggled at one of his campaign spots. That kind of thing, I think, will bring attention to it. And if you can mobilize large enough, some of these issues I think should be put as a demand. The first demand is that you allow an exemption from the necessary documents. The second is that you allow sponsorships, private sponsorships, to occur without the refugee status document. These types of things that are like real critical impediments to any real help on the ground, make them as demands, and then run a petition, run a campaign, get Amnesty involved, get the Canadian Council of Refugees involved, and blow it up as much as possible, get signatures. Again, like I said, inside Canada at an election time, tied to postal codes, where they can put a voter to a signature, I think can go a long way, and then take that to all of the campaign spots and put it to every single candidate. Because like Razmeen said, with an election so close, nothing's going to be done beforehand. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of holding people to account on their campaign promises for whoever might get elected. And now is the best time to try to get those promises out of them when they're trying to get your vote, rather than when they get in, and possibly even with a majority government, they're not really going to be that willing to listen at that point. So, we have 19 days.
Okay. Well, thank you both for doing the presentation today and answering all of our questions. Based on the comments, it seems like people were very appreciative, and they're thanking you for both your time, your knowledge, and your expertise. I think that's going to be a wrap on our event today, as we're nearing 8 p.m. As promised, this has been recorded. We'll be putting it up, and we'll send the link. We'll also create the fact sheet that Pantea volunteered me for. I'm joking, that was already planned, and we'll include some of the links on the fact sheet that we talked about, so that you have that somewhere and you can easily access it. Other than that, thank you very much everyone else for attending today and for asking all of your questions. It was truly an informative evening for me. And with that, good night, and hopefully we'll make some noise and get the government to make some changes as we need to.
Fantastic. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.